Gerald was 58 years old when he handed in his resignation letter. He had worked for the same engineering firm for 34 years. He had built things, bridges, drainage systems, infrastructure that still exists in the town where he was born and where he planned to spend the rest of his life. He had earned the retirement. He had planned it carefully. The pension, the savings, the small cottage or the garden he had always wanted, the fishing he had always meant to do more of. His colleagues threw him a party. His wife made a cake. His children came from 2 different cities to be there. And Gerald stood in the function room of a pub he had been going to for 3 decades and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, completely free. That was a Friday. By the following Wednesday, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in any way Gerald could point to or name. But the morning felt different. Longer. He had made a list of things he wanted to do with his first week of freedom. And by Wednesday, he had done 2 of them and lost interest in the third. He went to the garden and pulled some weeds. He made himself lunch. He watched the news, the lunchtime news, the kind he had never had time to watch before, the kind that turned out to feel oddly depressing at 12:30 in the afternoon. He told his wife that evening that he just needed to adjust, that it would take time, that everyone felt like this at first. His wife nodded. She had her own job, her own schedule, her own reasons to be somewhere every morning. She kissed him and said he was right. It would take time. And she left for work the next morning at 7:45, and Gerald sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the garden and felt, for the first time in 34 years, completely unnecessary. 3 years later, Gerald's GP noted at a routine checkup that his blood pressure had risen significantly since retirement. His weight had increased by 12 kilograms. His fasting blood sugar was in the pre-diabetic range. His cognitive assessment, a standard test of memory, processing speed, and executive function, had declined measurably from the baseline taken at his retirement medical. He was sleeping poorly. He had stopped fishing after the first summer. The garden was less tended than it had been. His GP asked him how he was finding retirement. Gerald thought about it for a long time. Then he said, and he said it quietly, as though admitting something he had not quite admitted to himself. He said, "I think I left too soon." His GP wrote that down, because Gerald was not the first patient to say it. And the research, it turns out, had been saying it for years. Today we are going to talk about why. 6 specific, science-backed reasons why seniors who retire early age faster, biologically, neurologically, physically, and psychologically, than those who keep working. Not because work is the only source of meaning. Not because retirement is wrong. But because what work provides, when it is taken away all at once, earlier than the body and brain are ready for it, leaves a set of specific biological gaps that the fishing and the garden and the lunchtime news do not automatically fill. And because Gerald deserved to know what was happening to him. And so, do you? Before we go any further, everything in this video is grounded in peer-reviewed research and published longevity studies. It is for informational and educational purposes only, and is not a substitute for professional medical advice or financial guidance. Retirement is a deeply personal decision shaped by health, finances, relationships, and individual circumstance. What this video addresses is the biological evidence around early retirement and aging, not a prescription for when any individual should retire. Please speak with your doctor and financial advisor before making retirement decisions. Your circumstances are unique and deserve personalized guidance. By the end of this video, you will know all 6 reasons, what is driving them biologically, what the research says, and what it means for how you approach retirement, whether you're planning it already in it or reconsidering it. Stay with me through to reason number 5, because that one contains a finding from a study so large and so precisely conducted that when I first encountered it, it changed the way I understood everything that work actually does for the human body. They lose the biological structure that their body depended on without knowing it. Let's begin with the reason that surprises people most. Not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most invisible. The one that was already happening to Gerald on Wednesday morning, before he had any language for what he was feeling. Work. Even work that is stressful. Even work that is demanding. Even work that the person has been looking forward to leaving for years. Provides something the body depends on in ways that only become visible when it is gone. It provides temporal structure. Your body runs on a series of internal biological clocks, the circadian rhythm and its subsidiary ultradian rhythms, that regulate hormone secretion, immune function, metabolism, digestion, cardiovascular output, and cognitive performance on precise 24-hour timing schedules. These clocks are not self-sustaining. They are anchored continuously every day by external cues: light, temperature, meal timing, social interaction, and crucially, the consistent daily schedule that tells the body when to be alert, when to perform, when to rest, and when to sleep. For 34 years, Gerald's body had been anchored by the same schedule: up at 6:15, breakfast at 6:45, in the car by 7:30, at his desk by 8, coffee at 10, lunch at 12:30, a particular quality of concentration in the afternoon, home by 6, dinner at 7, bed by 10:30. His body had built his entire hormonal and metabolic architecture around those anchors. Cortisol peaked at 6:15 to wake him with the energy to face the day. Insulin responded to meals arriving at predictable times. Melatonin began rising at 9 in the evening because 10:30 was always lights out. On the Wednesday after his retirement, all of those anchors were gone. Not reduced, gone. The morning cortisol peak had nowhere to direct its energy. The melatonin cycle had no fixed bedtime to prepare for. The metabolic rhythm had no meal schedule to anticipate. The body that had been running on the most precisely calibrated biological clock for 3.5 decades was suddenly operating without the external structure that clock required. A study published in the journal Current Biology found that the disruption of circadian rhythm consistency was directly associated with elevated inflammatory markers, metabolic dysregulation, impaired sleep quality, and accelerated biological aging. The effect was dose-dependent. The greater the disruption, and the longer it lasted, the more significant the biological consequences. Early retirees, who leave structured working life earlier and spend more total years without it, experience this disruption for longer than those who work until conventional retirement age. And the body, which is extraordinarily adaptable when the disruption is temporary, is considerably less resilient when the disruption becomes the permanent condition of daily life. Eleanor is 62 and retired at 59 after a 30-year career in nursing. She had expected to feel liberated. What she felt instead within 6 months was a biological restlessness she could not explain. She was tired during the day, but could not sleep at night. She was eating at irregular times and finding her digestion unreliable. She had put on weight despite eating less. Her mood was flatter than it had ever been. Her GP identified disrupted circadian rhythm as a primary driver. Eleanor had lost the external structure that had been anchoring her biology for 3 decades, and her body was showing the consequences across every system it ran. The intervention was not a return to work. It was a deliberate reconstruction of structure, a fixed wake time every morning regardless of what the day held, meals at consistent times, a scheduled commitment that required her be somewhere at a specific time 3 mornings a week. Within 4 months, her sleep had improved, her mood had stabilized, and her metabolic markers had moved back toward their pre-retirement baseline. Eleanor did not need her job back. She needed what her job had been providing without either of them knowing it. Structure is not a constraint. For the biological machinery of the human body, structure is oxygen, and early retirement, without deliberate reconstruction of that structure, removes it entirely. They experience a sudden and measurable decline in cognitive demand. Here is the second reason, and it is the one that the neuroscience community has been documenting with increasing alarm for the past 2 decades. The human brain maintains its architecture through use, not through passive maintenance, through active, daily, challenging use. The neural pathways associated with complex problem-solving, strategic planning, critical analysis, decision-making under pressure, and the management of competing information streams are maintained and strengthened by regular activation. When they are regularly used, the brain builds what researchers call cognitive reserve, a surplus of neural capacity that delays the onset and slows the progression of age-related cognitive decline. When they are no longer regularly used, those pathways begin to weaken through a process called synaptic pruning, the brain's mechanism for eliminating connections that are no longer earning their biological cost. Work, Particularly complex, skilled, cognitively demanding work provides a level of daily cognitive activation that is extraordinarily difficult to replicate in retirement. Not impossible, but difficult. And the people who do not deliberately replicate it show the consequences in their brain health relatively quickly. A landmark study published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences followed over 20,000 Americans aged 51 to 75 and measured their cognitive performance across multiple assessments over time. The finding was unambiguous. Each year of early retirement was associated with a measurable decline in memory and cognitive performance, specifically in verbal recall and fluid intelligence, at a rate significantly faster than those who continued working. The effect was present even after controlling for health status, income, education, and all other variables. The retirement itself was the driver. The researchers proposed a mechanism they call the use it or lose it hypothesis, a phrase that understates the biological precision of what is actually happening. When the daily cognitive demands of work are removed, the brain does not simply idle. It reorganizes. It begins to reduce the metabolic investment in the pathways that are no longer being activated. Synapses weaken. Dendritic branches retract. The neural infrastructure that supported 30 years of skilled professional performance begins, slowly but measurably, to reduce. In early retirees, who lose this cognitive activation earlier and for a longer period than those who work until conventional retirement age, the cumulative effect on cognitive reserve is significant. Studies examining the relationship between early retirement and dementia risk have found consistently elevated risk in early retirees compared to those who work longer. A study published in Social Science and Medicine found that each additional year of work was associated with a 3.2% reduction in dementia risk, meaning that retiring at 58 rather than 65 carries the accumulated cognitive risk of 7 additional years of reduced brain activation. Gerald was an engineer. For 34 years, his working day required him to hold complex three-dimensional spatial problems in his mind simultaneously, to track variables, manage constraints, anticipate failure modes, and make decisions under the pressure of real-world consequences. His brain had been performing at an extraordinary level of sustained cognitive demand for 3.5 decades. Within 2 years of retirement, the cognitive assessment that showed decline was not measuring anything exotic. It was measuring the predictable consequence of a brain that had been operating at full capacity for 34 years and had suddenly, at 58, received the signal that full capacity was no longer required. What Gerald needed, and what the research consistently identifies as protective, was not a return to the specific work he had done. It was a replacement for the cognitive activation that work had provided, something that required sustained attention, complex problem-solving, skill acquisition, and real-world consequence, something that gave the brain a reason to maintain the infrastructure it had built. The irony is that the brain Gerald had built over 34 years of engineering, that extraordinary cognitive instrument, was exactly what would have served him best in a rich, intellectually demanding retirement. He simply needed to be told to use it. Nobody told him. And in the absence of that instruction, the brain began quietly, efficiently, and without drama to let it go. Their sense of purpose undergoes a biological collapse, not just an emotional one. This is the reason people most expect to hear about, and the one they least expect to be biological. Everyone understands intuitively that retirement can affect a person's sense of purpose. The talk about it is everywhere, in retirement planning guides, in the advice given by friends, in the gentle warnings of family members who have watched someone struggle with the transition. What is not widely understood is that the loss of purpose after early retirement is not simply a psychological experience. It is a biological event, and it produces biological consequences that are measurable in blood panels, brain scans, and mortality statistics. Purpose, the daily experience of working towards something meaningful, something that requires your specific capabilities, something that would not happen without your participation, produces a distinct neurobiological signature. It activates the brain's dopaminergic reward system in a sustained, low-level way that is qualitatively different from the acute dopamine spikes produced by food, entertainment, or immediate pleasure. It maintains elevated levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein that promotes the growth of new neurons and the maintenance of existing neural connections. It regulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body's stress response system, keeping cortisol in productive range rather than allowing it to drift into either chronic elevation or chronic suppression. And it activates the same neural circuitry associated with the Japanese concept of ikigai, a reason for being, that research has linked to significantly lower all-cause mortality in older adults. When work ends, particularly when it ends early, before the person has built alternative sources of purpose to replace it, the neurobiological signature of purpose goes with it. BDNF levels drop. The dopaminergic reward system, deprived of its daily activation, becomes less sensitive over time. Cortisol regulation becomes less precise, and the brain's sense of forward motion, the daily experience of working towards something, is replaced by a present tense awareness that can feel, in its earliest stages, like freedom, and in its later stages, like floating. A study published in Psychological Science followed adults from working life into retirement and measured their sense of purpose across the transition, using validated psychological assessments alongside biological markers. The findings were striking. In early retirees, those who left work before 63, the decline in purpose scores was steeper, began sooner, and was accompanied by a more significant drop in BDNF levels than in those who worked until conventional retirement age. More critically, the decline in purpose scores was directly predictive of subsequent health outcomes, including cardiovascular events, cognitive decline, and all-cause mortality, even after controlling for all other health variables. Purpose is not a feeling that sits on top of biology. Purpose is biology, and its loss, particularly its early loss, before the systems that depended on it have been redirected towards something else, is one of the most significant biological events in the aging process. Victor is 67. He retired at 61 from a 35-year career as a secondary school head teacher, a role that had given him, every single day, a reason to be somewhere, something that required his specific capabilities, and 150 young people whose outcomes were directly affected by the quality of his attention and judgment. Within 18 months of retirement, Victor described something he struggled to name. He said, "I wake up and there is nothing that needs me. Nothing that would not happen without me. I have never felt that before, and I do not know what to do with it." His GP found elevated cortisol, significantly disrupted sleep, and the early markers of what would become, over the following 2 years, a clinical depression that required treatment. The depression was not the cause of Victor's biological deterioration. It was a symptom, the visible tip of a biological iceberg that had been forming since the morning he woke up and found that nothing needed him. Victor recovered. He became a school governor. He began mentoring newly qualified teachers through a local program. He returned, in a different form, to the thing that had given his biology its reason for being. His recovery was not merely psychological. His cortisol normalized. His sleep returned. His BDNF, measured at a research clinic that had been tracking him, rose measurably over the following 12 months. Purpose does not require a job title, but it requires something. And early retirement, without a plan for that something, removes the biological foundation of purposeful living at exactly the age when the brain and body need it most. They lose daily social complexity, and their biology reflects the loss. The fourth reason is one that most people who are planning retirement have thought about. In a general way, they know they will miss their colleagues. They have thought about staying in touch. They have told themselves they will make more time for friends. What they've almost never been told is that the social world of the workplace provides something biologically specific that friendship and family, however rich and warm, do not fully replicate. Work provides daily social complexity, not just social contact, social complexity, the navigation of hierarchies, the management of conflict, the reading of shifting interpersonal dynamics, the negotiation of competing interests, the maintenance of professional relationships that require ongoing calibration and effort, the cognitive and emotional work of existing within a social institution, with all of its politics, its alliances, its frustrations, and its daily requirement to understand and respond to other people's inner states, is one of the most demanding and most neurologically beneficial activities the human brain performs. Social complexity activates the social brain network, a distributed set of neural regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporal-parietal junction, and the superior temporal sulcus, that is responsible for theory of mind, emotional regulation, and the sophisticated modeling of other people's intentions and responses. When this network is regularly activated, it maintains its architecture and contributes directly to cognitive reserve. When it is no longer regularly activated, as happens when the social world contracts from a complex institutional environment to a smaller, more familiar circle of family and friends, the network receives less demand and begins to reduce its investment in the pathways that supported that demand. A study from the Rush Memory and Aging Project found that social engagement, specifically the frequency and complexity of social interactions, was one of the strongest predictors of cognitive resilience in older adults. The effect was specific to complexity, not merely frequency. People who had many interactions with small, familiar social circles showed less cognitive protection than those who had fewer, but more cognitively demanding interactions with a diverse social network. Early retirees, who leave the social complexity of the workplace earlier, experience this reduction in social cognitive demand for a longer period. And the cumulative effect on the social brain network and the cognitive reserve it supports is measurably significant in the research. Margaret is 65. She retired at 60 from a senior role in local government, a role that had required her to manage teams, navigate political relationships, negotiate with stakeholders, and make decisions that affected her entire organization. Her social world at work had been dense, demanding, and occasionally exhausting. In retirement, she has her husband, 3 close friends, her book group, and her children and grandchildren. She is not isolated. She is not lonely. But 2 years after retirement, she noticed that she was finding it harder to track complex conversations, that she was occasionally losing the thread in social situations that would never have challenged her before, that her sharpness, the particular kind of social and cognitive sharpness that had made her formidable in a meeting room, had softened in a way she could not quite reverse. Her neurologist, who had been monitoring her as part of a longitudinal aging study, identified reduced activity in the temporoparietal junction, one of the key nodes of the social brain network, compared to her pre-retirement baseline. Not pathological, not alarming, but measurably reduced, and directly correlated with the reduction in daily social cognitive demand that retirement had produced. The intervention was targeted. Margaret joined a community mediation program, voluntary work that required exactly the kind of interpersonal complexity her brain had been built to handle. She began attending a local council as a community representative. She took on a mentoring role with a young professional in her former field. Her follow-up scan 18 months later showed recovery in the temporoparietal junction activity. Her sharpness, the thing she had noticed softening, returned in a way she described as unmistakable. She told her neurologist, "I feel like myself again." Her neurologist said, "Your brain feels like itself again, and it is because you gave it back the work it was built to do." They experience a physical activity collapse that is hidden by the idea of a more active retirement. We have arrived at reason number 5, the one I promise you, the finding from a study so large and so precisely conducted that it changed the way I understood what work actually does for the human body. The assumption, almost universally held, almost entirely wrong, is that retirement produces a more physically active life. The walks you could not take because you were at your desk, the gym sessions you could not fit in because of the commute, the active hobbies you always meant to pursue. Retirement, the assumption goes, will make you more active. It will give your body more of what it needs. The data says something completely different. A study published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, tracking over 3,500 civil servants across the retirement transition using accelerometers to measure actual physical activity rather than self-reported activity, found that retirement produced, on average, a 93-minute per day reduction in physical activity in the first year. Not an increase. A reduction of an hour and a half every single day. An hour and a half. Every day, the mechanism is straightforward and, once named, completely obvious. Work. Particularly work that requires leaving the house, commuting, walking between buildings, standing, moving through physical space in the course of professional life, embeds a significant amount of physical activity into the structure of the day without the person needing to decide to exercise. The commute that felt like a burden was 30 minutes of walking. The building that felt like a constraint was 3 flights of stairs, multiple times a day. The colleagues whose offices required a walk down the corridor were 800 steps that nobody counted because nobody was thinking about steps. When work ends, that embedded, unthought, automatic physical activity goes with it. And the retirement activities that were supposed to replace it, the walks, the gym, the garden, require something that embedded workplace movement never required. A decision. Every single day, the retired person must decide, be active, and the research on decision fatigue, on habit formation, and on the psychology of behavior change consistently shows that activity requiring daily conscious decision is far less reliable than activity embedded in the structure of daily life. The consequences of a 93-minute daily reduction in physical activity maintained across the years of an early retirement are among the most significant in the aging literature. Reduced cardiovascular fitness, accelerated muscle loss, the sarcopenia that after 60 becomes one of the primary drivers of frailty, falls, and loss of independence, reduced bone density, impaired metabolic health, elevated inflammatory markers, and a body that is, in measurable biological terms, aging faster than the body the same person would have aged had they remained in work. A separate study published in The Lancet found that each additional year of physical inactivity in adults over 55 was associated with measurably accelerated biological age, assessed through telomere length, inflammatory markers, and metabolic profile. The effect in early retirees who accumulate more years of reduced physical activity than those who work longer was proportionally larger. Gerald's 12 kilograms, his rising fasting blood sugar, his elevated blood pressure. These were not the consequences of a man who had started eating more. They were the consequences of a man who was moving 93 minutes less every day than he had been moving for the previous 34 years, and who had no framework for understanding why that was happening or how to address it. The fishing he had planned was not equivalent to the movement his working life had provided. The garden was not equivalent. The walks he occasionally took were not equivalent. Not because those things were insufficient as pleasures, but because pleasures chosen intermittently cannot replace the structural, embedded, daily physical activation of a working life. Thomas is 70. He retired at 62 from a career as a hospital pharmacist, a role that had required him to be on his feet for most of an 8-hour shift, moving constantly between dispensary, wards, and consultation rooms. He estimated he walked approximately 8 to 10 kilometers every working day without ever thinking of it as exercise. In retirement, Thomas joined a gym. He went 3 times a week for the first 6 months, then twice a week, then once. By the end of his first year, he had canceled the membership and replaced his exercise intention with a daily walk that happened on some days and not on others. His body had gone from 8 to 10 kilometers of daily movement to an average of 2 to 3, and his health, which had been excellent at retirement, was measurably declining by the time he reached his 3-year retirement review. His GP did not tell him to go back to work. His GP told him what the research had shown, that the physical activity he needed was not exercise. It was structure. It was daily embedded movement that did not require decision. A part-time volunteering role at a hospital where he had worked gave him a reason to be somewhere on his feet, moving through space, 3 mornings a week. His daily step count tripled within a month. The body does not need to be told to move. It needs a reason to be somewhere. We are at the halfway point of our journey together today, and I want to pause for a moment. Of the 5 reasons we have covered, the loss of biological structure, the decline in cognitive demand, the biological collapse of purpose, the loss of social complexity, and a hidden physical activity collapse. Which one are you hearing about for first time? Which one? When you heard it, explain something that has been happening to you or to someone you love. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And I want to know, because the gap between what most people understand about early retirement and what the biology shows is one of the most significant and most consequential information gaps in the entire field of senior health. And stay with me for reason number 6, because it is the one that ties every other reason together. And it is the one that Gerald's GP had been trying to find a way to say for 3 years before Gerald finally gave him the opening. Their identity undergoes a biological reorganization that the body experiences as loss. We have arrived at the 6th and final reason, and like the purpose reason before it, This one sits at the intersection of psychology and biology in a way that most people have never been shown. When Gerald introduced himself to people for 34 years, he said, "I am an engineer. Not I work as an engineer. I am an engineer." The distinction is not grammatical. It is existential, and it is biological. Work, particularly long-term skilled identity-forming work, does not merely occupy the hours of a life. It organizes the self. It provides a stable, consistent, socially recognized answer to the most fundamental question the human brain continuously asks about itself. Who am I and why does it matter that I am here? When work is present, that question has an answer that is reinforced daily by the role itself, by the people around you who know you and your professional identity, by the social recognition and status that skilled work provides, and by the daily evidence that your specific capabilities make a difference that would not happen without you. When work ends, particularly when it ends early, before the person has constructed an alternative identity robust enough to replace it, the brain loses a stable foundation on which its sense of self has been built. And this is not merely a philosophical disorientation. It is a neurobiological event with measurable consequences. Research published in the Journal of Gerontology found that adults who experience what researchers called identity discontinuity at retirement, a significant gap between their pre-retirement self-concept and their post-retirement sense of who they were, showed elevated cortisol, disrupted immune function, faster biological aging, and significantly higher rates of depression and cardiovascular events in the 5 years following retirement compared to those who enter retirement with a robust alternative identity already in place. The effect was particularly pronounced in early retirees who had invested more years in building a professional identity and had less time to develop alternative sources of self-concept before leaving work. And it was particularly pronounced in people whose work had been highly skilled, highly socially recognized, and central to how they understood their own value in the world. Gerald did not simply miss his job. His brain was experiencing the loss of the primary organizing structure of his identity, the thing that had answered the question of who he was every day for 34 years. And without that answer, his nervous system entered a state of low-grade chronic stress that produced exactly the biological profile his GP had been documenting: elevated blood pressure, metabolic disruption, cognitive decline, disrupted sleep, and the particular flatness of a man who was lost, without knowing it, the story he was telling himself about who he was. The GP who had been watching this happen for 3 years finally had his opening when Gerald said, "I think I left too soon." Because leaving too soon was not the real problem. The real problem was leaving without taking anything with him, without a rebuilt identity, without a new answer to the question of who he was and why it mattered that he was here, without the biological foundation of purposeful self-concept that the research consistently shows is one of the most powerful protective factors in healthy aging. What Gerald needed, and what the researchers now begin to say clearly enough that retirement planning professionals are starting to listen, was not to delay retirement. It was to approach retirement as a transition that requires as much deliberate preparation for the psychological and biological self as it does for the financial self. A transition that asks not just what will you do with your time, but who will you be when the work is done? The answer to that question is not automatic. It does not arrive on the Friday of the retirement party. It has to be built deliberately, carefully, in advance. The way Gerald built the bridges and drainage systems and infrastructure that still exists in the town where he was born, with the same rigor, the same attention to what will bear weight, the same understanding that the most important structures are the ones you cannot see. Gerald found his answer. At 64, 3 years after his retirement, he began working with a local engineering college as a visiting lecturer, unpaid, 2 mornings a week, teaching the things he had spent 34 years learning in the field. The students called him by his first name. They asked him questions that required everything he knew. And Gerald, sitting at the front of the classroom at 64, introduced himself by saying, "I am an engineer," said it for the first time since departing the pub, and meant it again. His blood pressure at his next annual review was the lowest it had been in 5 years. His cognitive assessment showed recovery in 3 of the 4 domains where it had previously declined. His GP noted, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for this, that Gerald appeared biologically to be aging in the right direction. Gerald said, "I think I worked out what I left behind, and I found a way to take it with me." Let's bring all 6 reasons together. When you retire early, before the body and brain are ready, before the biological gaps have been filled, 6 specific things happen simultaneously. The biological structure that anchored every system in your body for decades is removed overnight. The daily cognitive demand that maintained your brain's architecture and built a cognitive reserve that protects against decline disappears. The neurobiological signature of purpose, the BDNF, the dopamine regulation, the cortisol balance, begins to erode without the daily activation that work provided. The social complexity of the workplace, which had been maintaining the brain's social network and contributing directly to cognitive reserve, contract into a smaller and less demanding social world. The embedded physical activity of working life, 93 minutes per day on average, vanishes, and the decision-based exercise that is supposed to replace it almost never does, at least not consistently or sufficiently. And the identity that work had been organizing and answering and reinforcing for decades is suddenly without its primary source, leaving the brain in a state of chronic low-grade stress that affects every other system simultaneously. These 6 things do not happen because the person has failed at retirement. They happen because nobody warned them that retirement, particularly early retirement, requires as much deliberate biological preparation as any other major life transition. And in the absence of that preparation, the body responds in the only way bodies know how to respond to the sudden removal of the structures they depend on. It ages toward them. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of preparation. Because every single one of these 6 biological gaps can be filled, not by return to work, not by abandoning retirement that was earned and deserved, but by building, deliberately and specifically, the replacements that the research identifies as protective. Structure, rebuilt through consistent daily routine. Cognitive demand, rebuilt through learning, creating, problem-solving, and skill acquisition. Purpose, rebuilt through contribution, through being needed, through maturing to something. Social complexity, rebuilt through voluntary work, community involvement, and the kinds of social engagement that challenge rather than simply comfort. Physical activity, rebuilt through embedding movement in the structure of daily life rather than leaving it to daily decision. And identity, rebuilt through the patient, deliberate construction of a new answer to the oldest question. Who am I? And why does it matter that I am here? Gerald found his answer in a classroom. Victor found his in a school governance board. Eleanor found hers in a fixed morning schedule and 3 voluntary commitments. Margaret found hers in a community mediation program that gave her brain back the social complexity it had been built to handle. Thomas found his in 3 mornings a week at the hospital where his feet had learned over decades to move. They are not exceptions. They are evidence. Evidence that the biology of aging is not a fixed trajectory, that it responds with remarkable speed and remarkable faithfulness to the inputs it receives, and that the most powerful inputs are not medications or supplements or expensive interventions. They are the things that were provided quietly and without anyone noticing for 30 or 40 years. The things that, when you know what they are, you can choose to keep. Here is what I want you to do right now. If you are approaching retirement or someone you love is, take this video seriously as preparation, not financial preparation, biological preparation. Ask yourself, for each of the 6 reasons we discussed today, what will replace this? What will provide the structure, the cognitive demand, the purpose, the social complexity, the physical activity, and the identity that work has been providing? Write the answers down. And if the answers are not clear, that is not a reason to delay retirement. It is a reason to do more thinking before you go. If you're already retired and you recognize yourself in Gerald's story, or in Eleanor's or Victor's or Margaret's, know this. The biology is not fixed. The gaps can be filled. The brain responds faster than most people believe, and the body follows. The research is not pessimistic about early retirees. It is very specific about what they need. And what they need is not complicated. It is simply what work was providing, rebuilt in a form that belongs entirely to them. Drop it in the comments. Tell me which of the 6 reasons surprised you most. Or Tell me what you have found that fills the gap, because the best answers in this community come not from the research, but from the people who have lived it and found their way through. Share this with someone who is planning their retirement, or who has been in theirs for a while and cannot quite name what has shifted. The right information at the right moment is one of the most valuable things one person can offer another. Subscribe if you have not already. New videos every week, grounded in real science, told through real stories, made for people who want to understand their own aging rather than simply endure it. Because Gerald is in a classroom on Tuesday mornings now. And the students cannot know, that the man in the front of the room who introduces himself by saying, "I am an engineer," is not simply describing a career. He is describing a biology that, at 64, is moving in the right direction again. That is what finding the answer looks like. Go find yours.